Working with clients, it's really hard to manage a lot of instances. And as shops get busier and it's harder and harder to find DBA talent, you end up managing more and more things. So trying to get to a state where you can keep everything in control and work on important problems is a good problem to have. Because realistically, one of the things we want to do is be able to enrich our businesses by helping them with better data and giving them better performance and things like that. And if we're worried about configuration settings or whether or not our backups are running, I mean, it's really important that your backups run, but you want to have that dialed in. So we're going to introduce you to some of the tools. So we're going to talk about a few things, dynamic SQL, a little bit of Powershell, some SSIS, and some other cool things I've done. And we're going to walk through all those. And there's some pretty cool demos we have. So let's get started. So how many of you's job feels like this? When you're a DBA and you're trying to keep everything running and not have it fall down. So you're running around in circles. I know I've been in a couple of shops where that was really my life. I was running the job before I worked for Comcast. I was running infrastructure for a large SAP project. And we were supposed to have a cloud provider do it, and that fell through, and I had to build all the infrastructure myself and go to meetings, and this was pretty much my life. Where I wanted to get was here, where I can relax, and I get notifications, and things aren't going to break. I know important things are going to get done. And that's really why I wanted to I learned automation. The other reason why I learned automation was my first week or two at Comcast. Microsoft issued a patch, and it wasn't SQL Server related. It was an RDP security patch, but it was a major security hole. And we had to apply this patch to 3,000 servers. And as I started to apply it to one or two of them manually, I was like, this really sucks. So I'm going to learn PowerShell. So I went to the Scripting Guys blog, which if you haven't found, I recommend. It's a blog from Ed Wilson, who works for Microsoft, and several other guest authors who do a lot of talk about scripting. This is another thing, and this may be a little hard to read, but I'll kind of walk through it. And this is from a comic called XKCD. The guy who writes XKCD used to be, I believe, an aviation engineer. But this is how long you should spend working on a routine task more efficient before you waste more time than you save. So the example I always like to think about is installing SQL Server. Denny and I do a lot of health checks. I run into a lot of SQL servers where somebody clicked next, next, next. Some of them are from Microsoft, because if you install a VM in Azure, that's kind of what you get. But here, installing SQL Server takes about 30 minutes. And in most organizations, I'll say you might have to do it weekly, or maybe even monthly. So if it takes you 30 minutes and you do this weekly, you should be willing to spend 5 days in order to automate that task. If you do it monthly, you should be willing to spend 1 day. I'll give you some scripts to install SQL Server automatically. That's not too bad, but it's something, and I think in IT we get even more benefit from automating stuff, because when we automate a process, it's going to happen in a clear, repeatable fashion. We're not going to have to worry about somebody setting the right max memory value. We're going to let a script do that for us. The other thing I like to talk about in relation to automation is standards. One thing that I really learned a lot about when we were doing automation. So when I was at Comcast, one of the things we did was we built our own private cloud environment. So much like with Azure, you can go in and request a SQL Server VM. We had the same thing. We built it ourselves, and so we had to automate that entire process. And I got some exposure not just to the SQL Server part, but to some of the Windows parts and some of the Linux parts. And one of the key things was having everything as standardized as possible. The main things that really affect SQL Server are drive locations. So in all of your SQL servers, you want to have the same drive letters if you can. I'm a big fan of using mount points, because that allows you to keep the same root drive system. You can add drives as needed. But anytime you have something that's different, that's really going to hamper any automation efforts, because the key to automation is being able to have a script do something instead of you having to do it. So here are the tricks of the trade that I'm going to talk about today. PowerShell, we're not going to talk a ton about PowerShell. The one demo I have that's going to be around PowerShell is going to be applying a patch to SQL Server. And I'll show you why PowerShell is a good use case for that, because there's some error handling and things we want to do. PowerShell still has its limitations for SQL. One of the biggest, I'm a big fan of SQL Cmd. How many of you have used SQL Cmd ever? Raise your hand. Okay, good. That's about 3/4 of the room. I'm impressed. That's way better than I usually see. PowerShell has this commandlet called Invoke Sequel Cmd. And one of the things I really almost always do in SQL Cmd is turn off headers. Because one of my frequent uses for SQL Cmd is to generate another SQL script that I'm going to run. In Invoke Sequel Cmd, the PowerShell commandlet, there's no way to suppress headers. So it becomes kind of painful. SQL Cmd I use a lot. SQL Cmd is really the core of most of my automation efforts that I do. It's really good at generating SQL. I still use DOS. Scott Klein and I, who's down front, were just talking about DOS and PowerShell and how I always use the PowerShell window, even though I run a bunch of DOS commands, because they mostly are supported in the DOS window, or in the PowerShell window. But I still use batch files. For my SQL installation process, it's still a batch file. PowerShell is not perfect at handling multiple command line arguments. And then finally, the last two things are dynamic SQL. So as a DBA, I always hated it when developers use dynamic SQL because it never performs right and the optimizer doesn't deal with it well. But it's really fantastic for automating DBA tasks. The demo we're specifically going to show around that is adding a database to an existing availability group. So we'll create a new database, take a backup, and add it through a stored procedure, and that's all using dynamic SQL. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit more about SQL agent jobs and some things you can do around that with automation. So PowerShell, I kind of have a love-hate relationship. I know I've been bashing it a little bit, but it's an incredibly powerful utility. For a lot of Windows tasks, or anything you have to do to a lot of servers, it's really a must-have. I like to think probably if you're a DBA and you're focused exclusively on SQL and you're managing less than about 20 servers, you may never have to use PowerShell. But when you get beyond that and you start having to do things to servers, like, for example, maybe change a DNS address or change some other Windows setting,